Hi everyone, and greetings from the Kurdistan region of Iraq. I'm over here for a couple of weeks, and Roger has asked me to do a quick introduction to the book of First Timothy, because we will be studying this book over the coming weeks. Before we got into 1 Timothy, I just wanted to give you an introduction to letter writing in Paul's day. Many people will say that 1 Timothy is not written by Paul because they see stylistic differences in the letter, and that shouldn't worry us, and this is the explanation why. In Paul's day, letters would have been written on papyrus, and papyrus is very expensive. Unlike paper today, we can throw away several leaves of paper. If we're writing a letter, we make mistakes. Back in Paul's day, that would have been prohibitively expensive. And so often people used professionals to write the letters for them. They would go to a scribe shop. There were often many of these in the high streets of Paul's day. And they would explain to the person, to the scribe, what they wanted to be put into the letter. And the scribe would write these notes down on a wax tablet, and then later would slowly and skillfully write the letters onto a papyrus sheet, and you would pick it up from him at some time in the future. 1 Timothy was written while Paul was in prison, so Paul probably didn't have the freedom to go to a professional scribal shop, but he could have had the scribe visit him. Alternatively, Paul could have used one of his good friends like Luke. Luke was a doctor. He would have been well versed in writing. But Paul did use these secretaries, or sometimes the theologians will call them an amanuensis. And we know that because if we read letters like Galatians in chapter 6, verse 11, Paul says, "See, when I write the final greeting in my own hand, how big my letters are." Paul was writing that final greeting, which was very common practice in his day. And his eyesight had deteriorated to the extent that when he wrote in very large letters. So what about the letter itself? Well, let's look at some background to this letter. First of all, we're saying that the author is Paul, and it was written when Paul was in prison. And we believe that Paul was in prison in Rome, and we date the letter, therefore, to around 64 AD. Paul was probably martyred later on in that same year. He had been imprisoned. He was, we believe, under house arrest. He could have visitors during house arrest, but he would have been confined to that one building. The recipient is Timothy, and Timothy was in Ephesus. He was at the church. He'd been sent to Ephesus by Paul to oversee the church there. And Paul was writing to Timothy, giving him like final instructions on how you need to run this church. And so the letter to Timothy is very, very practical. It gives very good practical advice on day-to-day Christian living. It talks about how we should behave in church. It talks about how we should pray in church. It talks about many aspects of church life. It talks about how the old should treat the young and how the young should treat the old. It talks about good teaching. It talks about how we behave when we're wealthy and privileged. And it talks about threats to the church. And this letter is a very precious letter as well, because the relationship between Paul and Timothy was one which was a very, very close relationship. It's almost like a father-son type of relationship. Paul regarded Timothy as an adopted spiritual son. We see that in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 2. And he recognized Timothy as having a very strong evangelistic gifting. And we see that in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 4. Timothy had worked with Paul in many different places, including Phrygia and Galatia and Mysia and Troas. Then we see that Paul had given Timothy some special responsibilities in other places like Athens and Thessalonica and Corinth and Macedonia. Timothy is also listed as a co-author of several of Paul's letters, including 2 Corinthians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Timothy was there in Ephesus, and he was running a church that Paul had planted, a church which was very precious to Paul. So we have a very precious church to Paul, and we have a very precious person to Paul. And we've got some of Paul's final words. 2 Timothy is probably the last letter that Paul ever wrote. And he says in there, my life is at this moment being poured out like a drink offering. And he knew that the end was coming, that he wasn't going to get out of prison alive, but he would be martyred for his faith. And so the letters of 1 Timothy and of 2 Timothy are very precious to us, because these are the final words, the final guidance that Paul is wanting to give to his very, very precious spiritual son, Timothy, in order to help him manage the church and the relationships in the church in Ephesus, a church which was very special to Paul. And so I think over these coming weeks, I think we're going to get some really, really good things out of this study. And so I would really encourage you to get involved with it and get deeply involved. One thing I would say is that don't just read the chapter that you're going to be studying each week. This is a letter. And when we write letters to our loved ones, we don't intend them to read paragraph by paragraph and put it down until tomorrow and read the next paragraph. We expect people to read the letter from beginning to end. And I think that's the best way that you could read this letter. Read it beginning to end. And when you've done that, read it again. And when you've done that, read it again and again. The more you read it, the more you'll start to understand exactly what Paul is trying to say. And as we do that, we'll get more out of this study. I think this is a very important study, and I thank Roger for the opportunity that we have to study this. So I'm going to sign off and go back to my bed. As you see, the sun is going down, and I need to be up very early in the morning. So goodbye and God bless you.